Sarah Matthews stood in front of the full-length mirror, her white dress catching the morning light that streamed through the church's bridal suite windows. Her hands smoothed invisible wrinkles from the silk fabric, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past few months of wedding planning. The room smelled of fresh flowers and hairspray, and somewhere down the hall, she could hear her bridesmaids laughing. 24 hours ago, everything had been perfect. She and Mike had been together for 3 years, building what she thought was an honest life in their small Alabama town. He worked at the local bank, coached Little League on weekends, and always remembered to bring her favorite coffee on Sunday mornings. They'd met at her cousin's barbecue, where Mike had charmed everyone with his easy smile and quick wit. Sarah's parents had taken to him immediately, especially her father, who found in Mike the son he never had. The wedding preparations had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly. 200 guests were already filing into the century-old Baptist church, its white wooden walls freshly painted for the occasion. The flowers had arrived on time, perfect arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. Even the weather had cooperated, bringing a crisp autumn morning with clear blue skies. Sarah's mom had always told her that when things seemed too perfect, life had a way of throwing a curveball. Those words echoed in her mind now as she stared at the crumpled paper in her hands, her engagement ring catching alight and throwing tiny rainbows on the wall. She'd found it purely by accident, stuffed in the back of Mike's desk drawer while looking for their marriage license paperwork. The arrest warrant was dated 5 years ago, the charges clear as day: armed robbery and aggravated assault. Her hands trembled as she read the details again. The Mike described in the document wasn't the man who brought her soup when she was sick or helped old Mrs. Johnson with her groceries. This Mike had held up a convenience store, threatened the clerk with a knife, and left a customer with a concussion. The warrant was from Georgia, just 2 states over. Close enough to run from, far enough to hide. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah sat down heavily on the antique settee, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled milk. 3 years of memories began to replay in her mind, each one now tainted with doubt. The way Mike always avoided having his picture taken. How he turned down a promotion that would have required a background check. His insistence that they have a small wedding, keep things quiet. "Sarah? Honey, you in there?" Her mother's voice came through the door, accompanied by a soft knock. "The photographer wants to start the pre-ceremony shots." Just a minute, Mom," Sarah called back, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos in her head. She folded the warrant carefully, tucking it into the small purse she'd chosen for the day. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent hours picking out a purse to match her perfect wedding, and now it held proof that her perfect life was built on lies. Sarah's heels clicked against the wooden floor as she made her way down the church's narrow hallway. Her heart pounded with each step, the warrant feeling like it was burning through her purse. She found Mike in the groom's room, adjusting his bow tie in front of a mirror. He turned at the sound of her entrance, his face breaking into that familiar smile that had made her fall in love with him. The smile faltered when he saw her expression. "Sarah? What's wrong? Isn't it bad luck to see the bride before the wedding?" She pulled out the warrant, holding it up with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. "When were you going to tell me about this, Mike?" The change in his face was instant. The warm, loving expression she knew so well disappeared, replaced by something cold and unfamiliar. His jaw tightened, and his eyes, those kind eyes she thought she knew so well, hardened into something dangerous. "Where did you find that?" His voice was low, controlled, but with an edge she'd never heard before. "Does it matter? Were you ever going to tell me? We're about to get married, Mike. 200 people are sitting out there, waiting to celebrate our love, our commitment, our trust, and I find out you've been lying to me this whole time." Mike ran his hands through his carefully styled hair, messing it up in a way that would have been endearing any other time. "It was a long time ago, Sarah. I was young, stupid, desperate. I've changed. You know me, the real me."
Don't eat.
Sarah's voice cracked. "The real you? The real you held a knife to someone's throat. The real you put someone in the hospital. The real you has been lying to me since the day we met." "Keep your voice down," Mike hissed, taking a step toward her. Sarah instinctively stepped back, bumping into the door. The look in his eyes scared her. It was like watching a mask slip, revealing something ugly underneath. "It's all in the past," he continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been meant to be soothing but came across as condescending. "I paid for my mistakes. I turned my life around. Why can't you just let it go? We're getting married in less than an hour." Sarah shook her head, tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "Let it go? You've been living under a fake name, Mike. Or is that even your real name? How am I supposed to trust anything you've ever told me?" His expression darkened further. "You're being dramatic. We can talk about this after the ceremony. Right now, we have guests waiting, and I've spent too much money on this wedding to let you ruin it with your hysteria." The dismissive tone in his voice, the way he prioritized the wedding over her feelings, the implicit threat in his stance, it all came crashing down on Sarah at once. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a simple omission. This was years of calculated deception. "I need some air," she managed to say, turning toward the door. Mike's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with enough force to make her gasp. "Don't make a scene," he warned. "Just calm down and think about what you're doing." Sarah yanked her arm free, her heart racing. Without another word, she fled the room, her white dress billowing behind her like a ghost. As she ran, she could hear Mike's footsteps following, then his frustrated grunt as he stormed off in the opposite direction. The perfect facade had shattered, leaving behind shards of truth that cut deep into everything she thought she knew. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning of the nightmare her wedding day would become. Sarah found herself in the church's small garden, her wedding dress gathering dew from the morning grass. Her phone buzzed constantly in her purse, probably her mother or bridesmaids wondering where she'd disappeared to. Next to the wedding-related text was a message thread from last night, friends wishing her luck, sharing their own wedding day jitters, telling her how lucky she was to have found such a great guy. "Lucky," she whispered to herself, letting out a bitter laugh that scared a nearby sparrow. The garden had been her favorite spot during wedding planning meetings with the church coordinator. Now it felt like a cage, with the church walls looming over her and the sound of arriving guests floating through the air. She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to share everything, to ask her friends what they would do in her situation. Would they run? Would they confront him again? Would they try to understand and forgive? The thoughts swirled in her head like autumn leaves in a storm. A notification popped up, a photo from her cousin Amy, taken just yesterday at the rehearsal dinner. Mike was mid-laugh, his arm around Sarah's waist, looking every bit the devoted fiancé. The same hands that had held a knife to someone's throat were tenderly holding her in that photo. The same smile that had charmed her family had hidden years of lies. "Sarah?" Her father's voice made her jump. He stood at the garden entrance, his bow tie slightly crooked and his face creased with concern. "Your mother's worried sick. What's going on, sweetheart?" She looked at her father, solid, dependable, honest to a fault. How many times had he praised Mike for being straightforward and trustworthy? The irony made her stomach turn. With trembling hands, she pulled out the warrant and held it out to him. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small like it used to be when she was a little girl coming to him with scraped knees or broken toys. But this wasn't something a Band-Aid and a kiss could fix. This wasn't a broken toy. It was a broken future, a broken trust, a broken heart. Tom Matthews' face darkened as he read the warrant, his jaw clenching in a way Sarah had only seen a handful of times in her life. His hands, calloused from years of construction work, gripped the paper so tightly it crinkled. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "In his desk. I was looking for the marriage license." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm morning. "He didn't even deny it, Daddy. He got angry that I found out. Like I was the one who did something wrong." Her father folded the warrant carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. Sarah recognized this version of her father, the one who appeared when he was holding back fury. "Does your mother know?" Sarah shook her head. From inside the church came the sound of the organist practicing the wedding march. The music felt like a mockery now, a cheerful soundtrack to her collapsing world. "We need to call this off," her father said firmly. "I'll handle Mike. You go with your mother, Dash." "Handle Mike?" Sarah interrupted, a new fear gripping her heart. "Daddy, don't Dash." Sarah Jane Matthews. Her father's voice was stern but gentle. "That man in there lied to all of us. He's violent. He's dangerous. And right now, he's cornered. I won't let him anywhere near you." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted from inside the church. Raised voices, the sound of something falling, then quick footsteps. Sarah's mother appeared at the garden entrance, her face pale. "He's leaving," she announced, slightly out of breath. "Mike just ran out through the side door. He's heading for the parking lot." Sarah's father started to move, but Sarah was faster. Still in her wedding dress, she ran past both her parents, ignoring their calls. She couldn't let Mike leave, not like this. She needed answers, needed to understand how 3 years of her life could have been built on such a massive deception. The garden path led directly to the parking lot, where she could see Mike throwing things into his car. Her feet carried her forward before her brain could process what she was doing. Behind her, she could hear her father calling her name, her mother's worried voice, and the growing murmur of guests who had noticed something was wrong. "Sarah, don't," her father shouted, but his voice seemed to come from far away. All she could focus on was Mike, the man she'd loved, the man she'd trusted, the man who had lied to her for 3 years, trying to run away again, just like he had 5 years ago in Georgia. The perfect autumn morning had turned into something else entirely, and as Sarah reached the parking lot, she knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of what would become the worst day of her life. The church parking lot was half full, cars decorated with white ribbons and "just married" signs that now seemed like cruel jokes. Mike had his trunk open, throwing in a gym bag he apparently had ready. Sarah's heart sank. He'd prepared for this possibility. He'd known this might happen. "You were going to run all along, weren't you?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the parking lot. Several guests who had been mingling outside turned to stare. The second things got tough. "You were ready to disappear again?" Mike slammed the trunk shut, his shoulders tense. "You don't understand anything, Sarah. I'm not that person anymore. I changed for you, for us. Why couldn't you just leave the past where it belonged? Leave it." Sarah was aware of the scene they were making, but she couldn't stop herself. "You lied to me every single day for 3 years. Was anything real? Do you even love me, or was I just good cover?" He turned to face her then, and something in his expression made her take a step back. It wasn't the Mike she knew, the one who brought her soup when she was sick or surprised her with flowers after a bad day. This was someone else entirely, someone with hard eyes and a clenched jaw. "Of course I love you," he said, but his voice was wrong, tight and controlled, like he was reading from a script. "I love you enough to try to protect you from this. From my past. I did my time, Sarah. I paid for my mistakes. I became a better man." "Your time?" Sarah's voice cracked. "The warrant says you ran before trial. You never faced what you did. You just started over with a new name and a new life, like nothing happened." More guests were gathering now, drawn by the raised voices. Sarah could see her bridesmaids at the church entrance, still in their pale blue dresses, whispering among themselves. Someone was holding back her mother, whose face was a mask of confusion and fear. "I was 22 and stupid." Mike's voice had an edge of desperation now. The guy recovered. "It wasn't as bad as they made it sound. I panicked, I ran, and then I met you. And everything changed. You changed me, Sarah." "Stop lying." Sarah's scream echoed across the parking lot. "Just stop. The truth, Mike. For once in your life, tell me the truth." He moved toward her then, his hands raised in what might have been meant as a calming gesture, but all Sarah could think about was what those hands had done. The knife they'd held. The person they'd hurt. She backed away, tripping slightly on her dress. "Stay back," she warned, her voice shaking. "Don't come any closer." "Or what?" Something ugly flashed across his face. "What are you going to do, Sarah? Call the cops? Turn me in? After everything we've been through? Her father's voice boomed across the parking lot. Step away from her, Mike. He was moving toward them, several of Sarah's uncles with him. Mike's eyes darted between them, calculating. This isn't over, he said quietly, just for Sarah to hear. Then he was in his car, the engine roaring to life. The tires squealed as he pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the scent of burned rubber and 3 years of lies. Sarah stood there, her white dress now dirty at the hem, watching the car disappear around the corner. She could hear people talking, could feel her mother's arms around her, but everything seemed distant, unreal. Her mind was already made up, though she didn't fully realize it yet. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sarah broke away from her mother's embrace, her movements mechanical, purposeful. She knew what she had to do. The voices around her, her mother's pleas, her father's warnings, her friends' concerned questions, all faded into background noise as she walked to her parents' car. Sarah, honey, where are you going? Her mother's voice was thick with worry. Home, Sarah replied, not looking back. I need a change. I can't wear this anymore. She gestured vaguely at her wedding dress, now stained and dirty from the parking lot confrontation. Her father stepped forward. I'll drive you. No, Sarah said quickly, too quickly. No, I need a minute alone. Please. She could feel her father's hesitation, could see the concern in his eyes. But he'd always respected her independence, always trusted her judgment. He handed her the car keys with only slight reluctance. Call us when you get home, he said. We'll handle everything here. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she drove away, she could see in her rearview mirror the crowd of confused guests, her devastated parents, the church that should have hosted her happiest day. But her mind was already at home, already in her father's study, already wrapping her fingers around the gun he kept in his desk drawer. The drive home was a blur. Sarah moved on autopilot, her mind replaying every moment with Mike, every lie, every sign she should have seen. The gun was exactly where she knew it would be. Her father had shown her years ago, taught her how to use it just in case. This felt like just in case. She knew Mike well enough to guess where he'd go. There was an old motel on the outskirts of town where they'd stayed once when his apartment was being fumigated. The kind of place that didn't ask questions, that dealt in cash and looked the other way. The gun felt heavy in her purse, heavier than the wedding ring in her pocket. She'd taken the ring off mechanically, placed it on her father's desk like an offering. Or maybe like evidence. When she pulled into the motel parking lot, Mike's car was there, just as she'd known it would be. Room 115, she could see him through the window, throwing things into a suitcase. Running again. Always running. Sarah stepped out of the car, her fingers wrapped around the gun in her purse. The afternoon sun was harsh, making everything look sharp and overexposed. A few doors down, a cleaning lady watched her curiously, probably wondering why she was still in a wedding dress. She knocked on the door. There was a pause, then Mike's voice. Who is it? You know who it is. Another pause. Then the door opened, and there he was, the man she'd almost married, the man who'd lied to her for 3 years, the man who'd held a knife to someone's throat and run away from the consequences. Sarah, he said, and his voice was different now. Harder, colder. You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have lied to me. What happened next would be debated in court for months. Some would say he moved toward her threateningly. Others would say she'd come with the intention to shoot. In the end, it didn't matter. The gun went off, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. Mike looked surprised more than anything else. He touched his chest, looked at his red fingers with confusion. Then he fell, and Sarah screamed, not because of what she'd done, but because in that final moment, she saw in his eyes the man she'd loved, the man she'd thought she knew. And then he was gone, and so was that man, and all that was left was Sarah in her dirty wedding dress, holding a smoking gun, watching her future bleed out on a cheap motel carpet. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Sarah sat down on the curb, the gun limp in her hand, and waited for them to come. The cleaning lady was on her phone, probably calling 911, probably describing the scene. A bride, a body, a beautiful day turned tragic. The sun was setting by the time they put her in the police car. Her wedding dress looked orange in the fading light, the bloodstains dark against the white fabric. As they drove away, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She was still wearing her veil. The county jail's holding cell smelled of bleach and despair. Sarah sat on the metal bench, still in her wedding dress, though someone had given her a dark blue blanket to cover the bloodstains. Her makeup had long since run down her face, leaving dark streaks that made her look like some tragic painting. Detective Marcus Chin sat across from her, his notepad open but empty. He'd been trying to get her to talk for the past hour, his voice gentle but persistent. "Miss Matthews, I know this is difficult, but we need to understand what happened." Sarah stared at her hands. They'd already tested them for gunshot residue, photographed them, fingerprinted them. They looked strange to her now, like they belonged to someone else. Yesterday, these same hands had been getting a French manicure for her wedding. "I want a lawyer," she said again, her voice hoarse from crying. "That's your right," Chin nodded, closing his notepad. "Your parents are here. They've already contacted James Morrison." "Know him?" Sarah nodded slightly. Everyone in town knew James Morrison. He was the kind of lawyer people called when things went really wrong. The kind who handled the cases that made the local news. Outside the holding cell, she could hear her mother's voice, high and desperate, arguing with someone. Her father's deeper tones followed, then silence. The heavy door opened, and her parents walked in, followed by a tall man in an expensive suit who could only be Morrison. "Sarah," her mother rushed forward, pressing against the cell bars. Her carefully styled mother-of-the-bride hair was falling apart, her makeup smeared from crying. "Oh, baby, what happened?" "Mrs. Matthews," Detective Chin stepped forward. "Please, we need to dash." "Detective," Morrison's voice cut through the room like a knife. "I'll need a moment with my client. Alone." Chin looked like he wanted to argue but nodded instead. He led Sarah's parents out, her mother's soft sobs echoing down the hallway. Morrison waited until the door closed before turning to Sarah. "Don't say another word to anyone but me," he said, pulling up the metal chair Chin had vacated. "The next 24 hours are crucial. They're already calling it premeditated." "Premeditated?" Sarah's voice cracked. The words seemed to echo in the small cell. I never meant to." "Save it." Morrison held up a hand. "The walls have ears, Miss Matthews. What matters now is building your defense. They'll use the fact that you went home to get the gun. They'll say you had time to cool down, to think about what you were doing. They'll paint you as a jilted bride out for revenge." The next few days passed in a blur of orange jumpsuits and legal terminology. Sarah was moved to the county detention center after her arraignment, where bail was set at $500,000. Her father emptied his retirement account and mortgaged the house to post it. The local news had a field day. Bride turns killer on wedding day ran across every channel. Morrison worked tirelessly, building a defense strategy around temporary insanity and extreme emotional disturbance. He hired a team of investigators to dig into Mike's past, to find everything he'd been hiding. The truth, as it turned out, was worse than the warrant had suggested. His real name was Michael James Peterson, Morrison explained during one of their meetings in the jailhouse consultation room. The robbery in Georgia wasn't his first offense. "We found a string of similar incidents across 3 states, all under different aliases. He was good at disappearing, starting over." Sarah felt sick. Each new revelation was like another punch to the gut. Did he hurt other people? Morrison hesitated, shuffling through his papers. There were 2 other assaults. Both victims survived, but one spent 3 weeks in the hospital. "Sarah, this actually helps us. It establishes a pattern of violence, supports your claim that you feared for your safety." "I didn't know any of that when I—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the words. "No, but you knew enough. You discovered his violent past, confronted him, and he reacted aggressively. You felt threatened. That's what we'll focus on." Outside the consultation room, Sarah could hear other inmates being moved through the hallways, the constant buzz of doors opening and closing, guards calling out to each other. This had become her world now. Cold rooms, hard chairs, endless questions about the worst day of her life. Her parents visited every day, bringing fresh clothes and news from the outside world. The story had gone viral, picked up by national news outlets. People were divided. Some saw her as a victim, others as a cold-blooded killer. Her mother told her about the protesters outside the courthouse, holding signs either supporting her or condemning her. "Your cousin Amy started a support group online," her mother said during one visit, trying to sound cheerful. "People are raising money for your defense. They're calling you a survivor, saying you exposed a dangerous criminal." Sarah didn't feel like a survivor. She felt like a ghost, drifting through days that all looked the same, replaying that moment in the motel over and over. Sometimes in her dreams, she made a different choice. Sometimes she just let him run. Sometimes she called the police instead. Sometimes she never found the warrant at all, and she was married, happy, living a life built on lies, but at least living. Morrison brought in Dr. Patricia Rivera, a forensic psychiatrist, to evaluate her. "We need to understand your state of mind," he explained. "Dr. Rivera will help establish the emotional trauma you experienced, the fear response that led to your actions." The sessions with Dr. Rivera were exhausting. She had to relive everything, not just that day, but her entire relationship with Mike. Every memory was now tainted, every happy moment twisted by the knowledge of his deception. "You experienced a severe psychological break," Dr. Rivera explained during one session. The discovery of his true identity, combined with his aggressive response to being confronted, triggered an acute stress response. In that moment, your actions were driven by fear and self-preservation. Sarah wondered if that was true. She couldn't remember clearly anymore. Had she been afraid? Angry? Both. The memory of that moment at the motel was both crystal clear and frustratingly blurry. She remembered the weight of the gun, the look in Mike's eyes, the sound of the shot. But she couldn't remember deciding to pull the trigger. Maybe she never really decided at all. The Jefferson County Courthouse was packed on the first day of the trial. Sarah sat beside Morrison, wearing a conservative navy blue suit her mother had bought for her. She'd lost weight in jail. The suit hung loose on her frame. The wooden defendant's chair felt hard and unforgiving beneath her. District Attorney Rebecca Torres approached the jury during opening statements, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about choices. Sarah Matthews made a choice that day. She chose to go home. She chose to get a gun. She chose to track down Michael Peterson. And she chose to pull the trigger." Sarah could feel the jurors' eyes on her. 6 men, 6 women. Morrison had spent weeks helping select them. A schoolteacher who'd once been stalked by an ex-boyfriend. A construction worker whose daughter had been in an abusive relationship. A retired nurse who'd worked in the ER and seen domestic violence up close. Each one chosen for their potential to understand, to sympathize. Morrison's opening statement painted a different picture. "This is a case about fear," he told the jury. About a young woman who discovered on her wedding day that the man she loved, the man she trusted, was a violent criminal living under a false identity. About how that man, when confronted, showed his true colors. About a moment of terror that ended in tragedy. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward at first. They had physical evidence, the gun, the bullet, gunshot residue on Sarah's hands. They had witnesses who'd seen her at the motel. They had security camera footage showing her arriving, entering Mike's room, leaving after the shot. But things got complicated when the witnesses took the stand. The cleaning lady, Maria Hernandez, described what she'd seen through her thick Spanish accent. The bride, she looked scared. Maria testified. Her hands were shaking. The man, when he opened the door, his face was different. Not nice. "I cleaned that motel 15 years. I know bad men when I see them." He had bad man face. Torres tried to discredit her on cross-examination. "Mrs. Hernandez, you were quite far from Mr. Peterson's room, weren't you? And you didn't actually see what happened inside." "I see enough," Maria replied firmly. "I see bride go in scared. I hear shot. I see bride come out crying." Sometimes you don't need to see everything to know what happened. The prosecution called forensics experts who testified about bullet trajectories and gunshot residue patterns. They called the detective who'd investigated Mike's original robbery case in Georgia, who detailed the violence of that crime. They seemed to think it would help their case, showing Mike's violent nature, but Sarah could see some jurors' faces changing as they heard the details, perhaps wondering what they would have done in her place. When Sarah finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She could feel everyone watching her. The jury, the spectators, the reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Her hands trembled as she was sworn in. "Miss Matthews," Morrison began gently, "can you tell us about the morning of your wedding?" Sarah's voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She described finding the warrant, confronting Mike, his reaction. "He wasn't the man I knew anymore," she said. "It was like a mask had fallen away. His eyes were cold, his voice was different. When he grabbed my arm in the church, it hurt." "And what made you go to your father's house?" Sarah stared at her hands. "I wasn't thinking clearly. Everything I thought I knew was falling apart. I kept seeing Mike's face when I confronted him, kept feeling his grip on my arm. I remembered the warrant, what he'd done to that store clerk. I was scared he might what, Sarah? Might hurt me. Might hurt my family. He'd fooled us all for so long. What else was he capable of?" Torres's cross-examination was brutal. "Miss Matthews, you had options, didn't you? You could have called the police. You could have let him leave. Instead, you chose to arm yourself and hunt him down. Those aren't the actions of someone who's afraid. Those are the actions of someone out for revenge." "No." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about how he'd lied to me for 3 years. How he'd been violent before. How he'd grabbed me at the church. When I got to the motel, I just wanted answers. But when he opened that door..." She paused, tears rolling down her face. His eyes were so cold. "He started moving toward me, saying I shouldn't have come. I remembered the warrant, what he'd done to that clerk, how he'd grabbed me earlier. My hand was in my purse on the gun. He kept coming closer. I didn't mean to pull the trigger. I didn't mean to..." Torres pressed harder. "But you did pull the trigger, didn't you? You shot an unarmed man who was trying to leave town. You stopped him from running away, just like he'd done in Georgia, just like he'd probably done before. You appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner." "Objection." Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom. Argumentative, sustained, Judge Harrison said, "Watch yourself, Miss Torres." But Sarah was already shaking her head. "You weren't there," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't see his eyes. You didn't feel what I felt. I didn't want to kill him. I loved him. Even after everything, part of me still loved him. But in that moment, when he came toward me, I was terrified. Not just of what he might do then, but of everything he was capable of. Everything he'd hidden. Everything he might do in the future." The courtroom was silent, except for Sarah's soft sobs. Even Torres seemed taken aback by the raw emotion in her voice. Judge Harrison called for a recess, and Sarah stepped down from the witness stand on shaky legs. As she passed the jury box, she caught a few of their eyes. Some looked sympathetic, others troubled. None looked convinced, either of her guilt or her innocence. Back at the defense table, Morrison squeezed her shoulder. "You did well," he whispered. "Now we just have to hope they understand." Sarah nodded numbly, watching as the jurors filed out for their break. She wondered if any of them could truly understand what it felt like to have your whole world shatter in a single morning, to discover that the person you loved most had been lying all along, to feel that moment of pure terror when a stranger, wearing your fiancé's face, came toward you in a cheap motel room. The trial took an unexpected turn when Morrison's investigators uncovered more about Mike's past. As Sarah sat in the courtroom, each new revelation felt like another knife twisting in her gut. The man she'd almost married wasn't just running from one crime. He'd been running his entire adult life. "Your Honor," Morrison addressed Judge Harrison, "we'd like to call Special Agent Karen Martinez from the FBI." The appearance of an FBI agent caused a stir in the courtroom. Martinez was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She took the stand with the confident air of someone used to testifying. "Agent Martinez," Morrison began, "could you tell us about your investigation into Michael James Peterson?" "We've been tracking him for 6 years," Martinez testified. "He operated under at least 7 different aliases across 5 states. The robbery in Georgia wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as Martinez detailed Mike's history. There had been other women before her, other lives he'd built and abandoned. In Ohio, he'd been Mark Jenkins, engaged to a bank teller until she caught him stealing from her drawer. In Florida, he'd been David Cooper, working as a youth pastor until someone recognized him from a wanted poster. In each case, Martinez continued, he integrated himself into the community, built relationships, gained trust. When his past caught up with him, he'd disappear, leaving behind confused and heartbroken victims. Some of them lost their life savings. Others lost their jobs. One lost her home. The jury seemed riveted by Martinez's testimony. Sarah could see them taking notes, their faces showing a mix of horror and fascination. Even Torres looked troubled by the extent of Mike's deceptions. During cross-examination, Torres tried to maintain the prosecution's narrative. "Agent Martinez, was Mr. Peterson wanted for any violent crimes at the time of his death?" "Not officially," Martinez admitted. "But we had evidence linking him to several incidents where victims were threatened or intimidated into silence." "But Ms. Matthews didn't know any of this when she shot him, did she?" "No," Martinez conceded. "She only knew about the Georgia warrant. So this additional information, while concerning, isn't relevant to her state of mind at the time of the shooting?" Morrison was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution can't have it both ways. They can't argue that the defendant's actions were unreasonable while trying to exclude evidence that proves the victim's dangerous nature." The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Sarah's mother, Elizabeth Matthews, took the stand on the defense's behalf. She looked older than she had on the wedding day, her face lined with worry, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "I knew something was wrong the moment Sarah found that warrant," Elizabeth testified. "Not just because of what it said, but because of how Mike reacted when she confronted him. I've known Sarah her entire life. I've seen her angry, seen her hurt, seen her scared. But I've never seen her look the way she did in that church parking lot." "Could you describe what you mean?" Morrison asked. Elizabeth dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She looked lost, like the ground had disappeared from under her feet. When Mike grabbed her arm, I saw something change in her eyes. It was like she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. "Did you witness Mr. Peterson's behavior that day?" "Yes." Elizabeth's voice hardened slightly. "He was different. The mask slipped, that's what I keep thinking about. For 3 years, he'd been this charming, kind man who made my daughter happy. But when she confronted him, something changed. His voice, his posture, even his eyes, everything was different. He wasn't the man we thought we knew." Torres approached for cross-examination. "Mrs. Matthews, you're testifying to help your daughter avoid prison. Isn't it possible that your memory of these events is colored by that desire?" Elizabeth met Torres's gaze steadily. "Miss Torres, I raised my daughter to tell the truth, to take responsibility for her actions. If I thought she'd murdered that man in cold blood, I'd be heartbroken, but I'd say so. What I saw that day wasn't my daughter acting out of anger or revenge. What I saw was a young woman whose entire world had just shattered, confronting a dangerous man who'd spent years lying to all of us." She turned to look at the jury. "You haven't just heard about Mike's crimes, you've heard about his pattern. He didn't just lie about his past, he created entire fake lives. He fooled everyone, me, my husband, our whole community. When Sarah discovered the truth, he didn't show remorse. He didn't try to explain. He got aggressive, then tried to run. Again, like he always did." Sarah watched as her mother's testimony seemed to resonate with the jury. Several of them nodded slightly as Elizabeth spoke. One juror, an older woman who'd been taking detailed notes throughout the trial, wiped away tears. The day's testimony ended with the courtroom in a somber mood. As Sarah was led back to her holding cell, she could hear reporters outside the courthouse, their voices carrying through the windows. The case had captured national attention, becoming a symbol of something larger, about trust, about deception, about the moments that change lives forever. In her cell that night, Sarah thought about her mother's words. The mask slipping. That's what had haunted her most about that day, not just discovering Mike's lies, but seeing the person behind them emerge. The stranger who'd worn her fiancé's face for 3 years, who'd smiled with her family while hiding a history of violence and deception. The jury deliberated for 5 days. Each morning, Sarah was brought to the courthouse to wait, sitting beside Morrison at the defense table, watching the door to the jury room. Her mother brought her fresh clothes daily, simple, conservative outfits that made her look young and vulnerable. Her father sat in the front row, his face growing more haggard with each passing day. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Sarah spent hours in the holding cell beneath the courthouse, listening to the muffled sounds of footsteps above. Every time the bailiff appeared, her heart would jump, thinking this was it, the moment she'd learn her fate. On the 5th day, just after lunch, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters rushed in with their notepads, spectators jostled for seats, and both legal teams took their places. Sarah felt like she might be sick. "It'll be okay," Morrison whispered, but she could hear the tension in his voice. Judge Harrison entered, and everyone stood. Sarah's legs felt weak. As they sat back down, she caught a glimpse of the jury filing in. Their faces were unreadable, eyes carefully avoiding hers. Members of the jury, Judge Harrison's voice seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, a middle-aged woman who'd reminded Sarah of her high school math teacher. "We have, Your Honor." Sarah grabbed Morrison's arm. The room seemed to spin slightly. She could hear her mother's soft prayers from the gallery behind her. "What say you?" The foreperson's voice was clear and steady. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Sarah Matthews, not guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sarah felt her breath catch. "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The murmur grew louder. Sarah's grip on Morrison's arm tightened. "On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Sarah heard her mother's sob, her father's sharp intake of breath. Reporters were already rushing for the doors, phones in hand. Morrison squeezed her shoulder, whispering something about it being better than they'd hoped for, but Sarah barely heard him. "Guilty." The words seemed to echo in her head. She was guilty, not of murder, but of taking a life. The distinction felt meaningless in that moment. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week. Sarah spent the days in between meeting with Morrison, preparing her statement to the court. They gathered character witnesses, her former teachers, her boss from the dental office where she'd worked, even her childhood pastor. When the day came, Sarah stood before Judge Harrison in another conservative suit, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their shaking. "Miss Matthews," the judge began, "voluntary manslaughter is a serious offense. A life was taken. However, this court must consider the unique circumstances of this case." Sarah stared straight ahead as the judge continued, detailing the mitigating factors, her clean record, her immediate remorse, the evidence of Mike's deceptions, and past violence. "The prosecution recommends 15 years, Judge Harrison said. "The defense has asked for 5. Having considered all factors, including the jury's finding that this was not a premeditated act but one committed in the heat of passion, I sentence you to 10 years in a state correctional facility." The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 10 years. She would be 34 when she got out. A decade of her life, gone. "With good behavior," the judge continued, "you'll be eligible for parole in 7 years. I also recommend psychological counseling during your incarceration." Sarah nodded mechanically. Behind her, she could hear crying, her mother, probably. Or maybe one of her friends. She couldn't bring herself to look. "Miss Matthews," Judge Harrison's voice softened slightly. "Would you like to address the court before you're remanded?" Sarah had prepared a statement with Morrison, practiced it dozens of times. But standing there, the words felt hollow. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry that someone died because of my actions. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused everyone. I keep thinking about that day, about all the different choices I could have made. I'll think about it every day for the rest of my life." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I'm also sorry that I didn't know who Mike really was. I'm sorry that I spent 3 years loving someone who didn't exist. I'm sorry that when I found out the truth, I didn't know how to handle it. I'm sorry that in one moment of fear and confusion, I made a choice I can never take back." The courtroom was silent as she finished speaking. Even the reporters had stopped writing, their pens frozen above their notepads. "Thank you, Miss Matthews," Judge Harrison said quietly. "Bailiff, please remand the defendant into custody." As they led her away, Sarah caught one last glimpse of her parents. Her father was holding her mother, both of them crying now. Morrison was already talking about an appeal, but Sarah barely heard him. In her mind, she was back in that motel room, watching Mike's face change, feeling the weight of the gun in her hand. She would replay that moment every day for the next 10 years, wondering if she could have chosen differently. The heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind her with a sound of finality. Sarah Matthews, almost bride, now convicted felon, walked toward her future, leaving behind a wedding dress stained with blood and a life that would never be the same. The Alabama Women's Correctional Facility looked exactly like prisons in movies: high concrete walls, razor wire, guard towers. Sarah's first night there, lying on a thin mattress in her cell, she listened to the strange symphony of prison life: doors clanging, voices echoing, the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Her prison uniform was orange, not white like her wedding dress. Sometimes that small detail would hit her unexpectedly, making her laugh until the laughter turned to tears. Her cellmate, a woman named Teresa serving 5 years for fraud, quickly learned to recognize these moments and would silently pass her tissues. The first year was the hardest. Sarah jumped at loud noises, flinched when people moved too quickly. The prison psychiatrist diagnosed her with PTSD, not just from the shooting but from the trauma of discovering Mike's true identity. They met twice a week, slowly unpacking the layers of betrayal and fear that had led to that moment in the motel. "You're not just grieving the loss of Mike," Dr. Richardson told her during one session. "You're grieving the loss of who you thought he was, who you thought you were, the future you thought you had. That's a complex kind of grief." Sarah joined a support group for women who had committed crimes in moments of emotional crisis. They met in the prison library every Thursday, sharing their stories over the sound of distant doors slamming. Some had killed abusive partners, others had snapped under years of pressure. All of them understood the way a single moment could change everything. Her parents visited every weekend, bringing news from the outside world. Her mother talked about the foundation they'd started in her name, aimed at helping women recognize signs of deception in relationships. Her father, who'd aged 10 years in the first months after her conviction, would just hold her hand across the visiting room table. "People still ask about you," her mother said during one visit. "That support group Amy started? It's grown into a whole network. They're using your story to teach young women about red flags in relationships, about trusting their instincts." Sarah found purpose in the prison's education program. She earned her associate's degree through a correspondence course, then started tutoring other inmates studying for their GEDs. Teaching helped her focus on something besides her own story, her own guilt. The guards called her the quiet one. She never caused trouble, never complained. At night, she wrote in journals Morrison had sent her, trying to understand her own actions. Some nights she wrote letters to Mike, letters she knew she'd never couldn't send. She wrote about the life they might have had if he'd been honest, about the moment she found the warrant, about the look in his eyes at the motel. 7 years into her sentence, Sarah was granted parole. She stood before the board in a borrowed blazer, her hair streaked with early gray, and talked about redemption, about growth, about understanding. "I'll never forget what happened," she told them. I'll never stop being sorry for taking a life. But I'm not the same person who walked into this prison. I've learned to look at things differently, to understand that every choice we make ripples out and affects others. The day she walked out of prison, her parents were waiting. Her mother had aged, her father's hair had gone completely white, but their love was unchanged. The world felt too big, too bright. Cars looked different, phones were smarter, fashions had changed. But the biggest changes were inside her. They drove her home to Alabama, to the house she'd grown up in. Her old room was exactly as she'd left it, down to the framed photo of her college graduation on the dresser. Her mother had cleared out all the wedding pictures, all traces of Mike, but Sarah could still feel the echoes of that day in every corner. "What now?" her father asked over dinner that first night home. Sarah had thought about this question for years. "I want to help people," she said. "Not just women in bad relationships, but anyone who feels trapped, anyone who thinks violence is their only option. I want them to know there's always another choice." She started small, speaking at women's shelters and support groups. Her story resonated. The bright young dental assistant who'd nearly married a con man, who'd lost everything in a moment of fear and confusion. Some people still judged her, still saw her as a killer, but others understood. They saw themselves in her story, recognized their own close calls with deception and violence. The foundation her parents had started grew. Sarah worked with them, sharing her experience, helping develop programs to teach young people about healthy relationships and conflict resolution. She spoke at high schools, colleges, anywhere people would listen. One rainy Tuesday, 5 years after her release, Sarah visited the church where she was supposed to have gotten married. It was quiet inside, smelling of wood polish and old hymnals. She sat in a pew, listening to the rain against the windows. A young woman was arranging flowers at the altar, white roses, like the ones Sarah had chosen for her wedding. The woman looked up, recognized her from the news coverage that still occasionally ran. Are you Sarah Matthews?" she asked hesitantly. Sarah nodded, expecting the usual mix of curiosity and judgment. Instead, the woman smiled softly. "Your story saved my sister," she said. "She was dating this guy. Things weren't right, but she couldn't see it. Then she heard you speak at her college. She started noticing the red flags, the little lies. She got out before." The woman trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Sarah felt tears in her eyes, but they weren't the bitter tears she'd cried in prison. These were different. Tears of understanding, of acceptance, of the knowledge that even the darkest moments could lead to light. As she left the church, the rain had stopped. Sarah stood for a moment in the parking lot where she'd confronted Mike that day, where everything had started to unravel. The memory was still there, but it didn't have the same power over her. She was different now, stronger, wiser, more compassionate. She carried her scars, but they had become part of her story, part of the wisdom she could share with others. The sun broke through the clouds as Sarah walked to her car. She had another speaking engagement that evening, a group of domestic violence survivors learning to trust again. She would tell them her story, all of it, the wedding dress and the warrant and the gun and the years of reflection that followed. She would tell them about choices and consequences, about forgiveness and growth. Most importantly, she would tell them about hope, hope that even after the darkest moments, there could be light again.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.